Welcome to Pages from History. Today, we're traveling back to 1942 to a city that became the graveyard of armies, Stalingrad. The name alone sends shivers down the spine of anyone who knows its story. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about human endurance and the true cost of war. This should have been impossible. No city should have survived what Stalingrad endured. Yet somehow, through unimaginable horror, it became the turning point of the entire Second World War. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. First, the city that refused to fall. The summer of 1942 was scorching across the Soviet steppes. German forces had been pushing eastward for over a year, and now they stood at the threshold of a city that bore the Soviet leader's name, Stalingrad. It stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, an industrial powerhouse that manufactured tanks, weapons, and the machinery of Soviet resistance. But this wasn't just another target on a military map. This was personal. For Adolf Hitler, conquering the city named after Joseph Stalin would be the ultimate propaganda victory. For Stalin himself, losing it was unthinkable. The city sprawled for nearly 30 miles along the river, a ribbon of factories, apartment blocks, and warehouses. Before the war, nearly 500,000 people called it home. They worked in the tractor factory that had been converted to produce tanks. They labored in the Red October steel plant and the Barricade gun factory. These weren't just industrial sites. They were symbols of Soviet industrial might, proof that the worker state could forge its own destiny. Now, those same factories would become fortresses in a battle unlike any the world had ever seen. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the German Sixth Army as it approached Stalingrad in August 1942. He was a meticulous planner, a career officer who believed in the power of organization and superior firepower. His army had swept across the southern Soviet Union with terrifying efficiency. Behind him lay conquered cities and broken armies. Ahead lay what he thought would be another quick victory. He had nearly 300,000 men under his command, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Every tactical advantage seemed to favor the Germans. But Paulus didn't understand what he was walking into. This wouldn't be a battle of maneuver and encirclement like the ones that had brought him this far. This would be something else entirely. Something that would test every assumption about modern warfare. The first massive air raid came on August 23rd. Wave after wave of German bombers darkened the sky over Stalingrad. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiary bombs. The goal wasn't just military targets, it was terror. The city erupted in flames that could be seen for miles. Wooden buildings became torches. Oil storage tanks exploded in massive fireballs. The Volga itself seemed to catch fire as burning oil spread across its surface. Civilians ran through streets turned into furnaces, seeking shelter that no longer existed. In a single day, more than 40,000 people died. The city that had thrived as an industrial center became a landscape of ruins. Yet something unexpected happened in those ruins. Instead of facilitating German conquest, the destruction created a new kind of battlefield. Every collapsed building became a defensive position. Every pile of rubble offered cover. The wide boulevards that tanks could have easily rolled down were now blocked by mountains of debris. The Germans had destroyed the city, but in doing so, they had created the perfect environment for desperate defenders to fight back. General Vasily Chukov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad. He was 42 years old, a veteran of the Civil War who who had learned his trade in the brutal conflicts that followed the revolution. Zhukov understood something that Paulus didn't. He understood that in urban warfare, all the traditional advantages disappeared. Tanks became vulnerable. Aircraft couldn't distinguish friend from foe among the ruins. Superior numbers meant less when every building had to be taken room by room, floor by floor. Zhukov developed a doctrine he called hugging the enemy. Keep your forces so close to the Germans that they can't use their artillery or air support without hitting their own troops. Turn every building into a fortress. Make them pay in blood for every meter. Can you imagine what it was like for the soldiers who had to implement this strategy? German and Soviet troops fought, separated by a single wall. They could hear each other breathing. Grenades were thrown through windows. Bayonets and entrenching tools became weapons when ammunition ran out. Soldiers fought in the daytime and could see their enemies' faces. At night, they listened to the sounds of the wounded dying in no man's land between positions. The Mamayev Kurgan was a hill that dominated the center of Stalingrad. Before the war, it had been a pleasant park where families picnicked and children played. Now it became the most contested piece of ground in the entire battle. Whoever controlled the height could observe enemy movements and direct artillery fire across the city. The hill changed hands multiple times. Soviet forces would capture it at night through desperate assaults. German forces would retake it at dawn with overwhelming firepower. The slope became so saturated with metal from shells and bullets that nothing could grow there for years after the war. Thousands died fighting for this single hill. The grain elevator stood near the river, a massive concrete structure used for storing wheat. In September, a small group of Soviet Marines and soldiers took up defensive positions inside. German forces surrounded it completely, cutting off any hope of reinforcement or escape. For 5 days, the defenders held out. They ran out of ammunition and fought with whatever they could find. They ran out of water and drank from puddles mixed with blood. They ran out of food entirely. German soldiers who finally broke into the elevator found the dead and dying scattered through its corridors. But they also found something else, a level of determination they hadn't encountered before. The defenders had known they couldn't win, couldn't escape, couldn't survive. Yet they fought anyway, buying time measured in hours for the broader defense of the city. The factory district became a world unto itself. 3 massive industrial complexes dominated the northern part of Stalingrad. The Red October factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the tractor factory that now produced tanks instead of farm equipment. These weren't ordinary buildings. They were steel and concrete fortresses with multiple levels, underground tunnels, and countless rooms. Fighting here descended into a nightmare of close-quarter combat. German troops would secure the ground floor, only to come under fire from workers and soldiers hiding in the basement. They would fight their way to the second floor and find Soviet snipers waiting in the machinery. Days of fighting might result in capturing half a building, while the other half remained in enemy hands. Workers who had labored in these factories before the war now fought to defend them. They knew every passage, every hiding spot, every structural weakness. Some continued working even as battles raged around them, repairing damaged tanks and weapons under fire. The Red October factory became legendary for its resistance. German forces attacked it repeatedly throughout October and November, throwing regiment after regiment into the furnace of its ruins. They captured sections of it multiple times, only to be driven out by counterattacks. The factory became a symbol of something larger than military strategy. It represented the refusal to surrender even when surrender made rational sense. But what happened next would test that determination beyond anything anyone had imagined. The German advance continued to grind forward meter by bloody meter. Paulus committed more and more of his forces into the city fighting. He believed that one more push, one more assault, would break Soviet resistance. His superiors in Germany demanded victory. Hitler had publicly declared that he would take Stalingrad. Retreat or failure were not options. So the Germans kept attacking, kept dying, kept destroying themselves against the ruins they had created. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga River every night under heavy fire. The river was the lifeline of the defense. Boats and rafts made the journey loaded with soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. German artillery and aircraft pounded the crossing points constantly. Many boats never made it across. Those that did often arrived with half their passengers dead or wounded. Yet every night more came. Chukhov's army was being bled white, but it was being continuously reinforced. As long as the Volga remained open, the defense could continue. The coming of autumn brought new horrors. Rain turned the rubble into mud. Temperatures began to drop. Soldiers on both sides lived in holes in the ground and cellars of destroyed buildings. They had no proper shelter, inadequate food, and constant exposure to death. Disease began to spread. Typhus and dysentery killed men that bullets had missed. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The wounded often couldn't be evacuated. They lay where they fell, their cries mixing with the constant roar of artillery and gunfire. Yet somehow, impossibly, Soviet forces held on. They held the thin strip of land along the Volga. They held sections of the factories. They held Mamayev-Kurgan through attacks that should have overwhelmed them. Every day that Stalingrad didn't fall was a victory. Every week that passed meant the Germans were being drawn deeper into a battle they couldn't win. But nobody knew that yet. In October of 1942, as German troops pushed to within meters of the Volga in some places, it looked like the defense might finally crack. The city that refused to fall seemed to be on the verge of falling anyway. The psychological toll was immense on both sides. German soldiers wrote home describing Stalingrad as hell on earth. They had been told they were fighting subhuman enemies who would collapse at the first show of strength. Instead, they found opponents who fought with terrifying determination. Soviet soldiers faced their own psychological demons. They knew that retreat meant execution under Stalin's infamous Order No. 227. Not one step back. Desertion meant death. Cowardice meant death. Even survival could be suspect. Yet they also fought for something deeper. For their homes, for their families. For the sense that if Stalingrad fell, everything would fall. Individual acts of heroism became commonplace simply because the situation demanded it constantly. A sergeant named Yakov Pavlov led a small group that captured and held an apartment building for 58 days against continuous German attacks. The building, later named Pavlov's House, commanded a strategic position overlooking a square. Pavlov's men fortified it, mined the approaches, and fought off assault after assault. They received supplies and reinforcements through a communication trench connected to Soviet lines. The building became a fortress within a fortress, a symbol of stubborn resistance that the Germans could see but couldn't overcome. Snipers on both sides turned the ruins into a deadly game of patience and precision. Vasily Zaitsev became the most famous Soviet sniper, credited with over 200 kills during the battle. He taught other soldiers his techniques, creating a school of snipers who terrorized German positions. The Germans sent their own expert marksmen to hunt the hunters. A legendary duel supposedly took place between Zaitsev and a German sniper school director, though historians still debate whether it actually happened. True or not, the story captured something real about Stalingrad. It had become personal. This wasn't just army against army anymore. It was soldier against soldier, will against will. Night brought no relief. Darkness meant raids, infiltrations, and desperate attempts to improve positions before dawn. Soviet forces preferred to attack at night when German air superiority didn't matter. They would launch sudden assaults on isolated German positions, trying to push the invaders back even a few meters. German forces used searchlights and flares to illuminate the battlefield, turning night into a hellish twilight where shadows moved and men died. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. Exhaustion accumulated day after day until soldiers operated in a fog of fatigue, punctuated by moments of terror. The Volga itself became a graveyard. Sunken boats littered its bottom. Bodies floated downstream. Ice began to form as November arrived, making crossings even more dangerous. Yet the river had to remain open. It was the only connection to the outside world, the only way to bring in reinforcements and supplies. Engineers worked constantly to maintain crossing points. Boatmen braved the fire night after night. The Volga was the difference between resistance and annihilation. By the end of November, German forces had captured 90% of Stalingrad. They held most of the factories. They controlled most of Mamayev-Kurgan. They had pushed Soviet forces into a few desperate pockets along the river. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Just a little more effort. Just a few more days. Just one more push and the city would fall. General Paulus requested permission to consolidate his positions and wait for spring. Hitler refused. Take the city now. Finish this. The Führer couldn't accept anything less than total victory. What neither Hitler nor Paulus fully understood was that while they focused everything on Stalingrad, the Soviets were planning something else entirely. Something that would transform the battle from a desperate defense into something very different. Winter was coming to the steppes, and with it would come a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the German war machine. Second, hell frozen over, November 19th, 1942. A temperature had dropped below freezing across the steppes north and south of Stalingrad. Snow began to fall, covering the charred ruins in white. But something else was happening in that winter dawn. Something that would change everything. At 0730 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire along a 200-mile front. The ground shook with the fury of thousands of guns firing simultaneously. This wasn't defensive fire. This was the opening of Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that had been planned in absolute secrecy. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had been working on this plan for months. While the world watched the desperate fighting in Stalingrad, Soviet commanders had been quietly assembling huge forces north and south of the city. Over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces. They had studied the German positions carefully and identified the critical weakness. The flanks of the German advance were held not by German troops, but by Romanian and Italian armies. These Allied forces were poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and not prepared for the kind of assault that was about to hit them. The Soviet plan was brilliantly simple. 2 massive pincers would drive through the weak flanks, meet somewhere west of Stalingrad, and trap the entire German Sixth Army inside a pocket. Paulus and his 300,000 men would be cut off from supply, reinforcement, and escape. The hunters would become the hunted. Romanian positions north of Stalingrad disintegrated within hours. The soldiers there had been told they were holding a quiet sector. Instead, they faced an avalanche of Soviet armor and infantry. Some units fought bravely. Most simply broke and ran. By the end of the first day, Soviet tanks had penetrated 30 miles behind German lines. Communications broke down. Panic spread. German commanders frantically tried to understand what was happening, but events were moving too fast. The southern pincer attacked on November 20th. Again, Romanian forces bore the brunt of the assault. Again, they collapsed under overwhelming pressure. Soviet tank columns raced westward across the frozen steppe, bypassing strong points, ignoring resistance, focused only on reaching the meeting point. German reserve units tried to stop them and were swept aside. The speed of the advance shocked everyone, including some Soviet commanders who had expected stronger resistance. On November 23rd, the two Soviet forces met at the town of Kalak, west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. General Paulus and the entire German Sixth Army were surrounded. What had been an offensive force grinding toward victory was now trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles across. The besiegers had become the besieged. The initial German reaction was disbelief. How could this have happened? They had been on the verge of taking Stalingrad. They controlled the city. They had the tactical advantage. Yet now they were cut off, surrounded by Soviet forces that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out of the encirclement, while his army still had strength and mobility. His chief of staff drafted plans for a fighting withdrawal to the west. They could abandon Stalingrad, punch through the Soviet lines, and rejoin German forces outside the pocket. It would mean giving up all they had fought for, but it would save the army. Hitler refused. The order came back clear and unequivocal. Stand fast. Hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe will supply you by air. Relief forces are being assembled. Do not attempt to break out. The Führer was convinced that giving up Stalingrad would be a propaganda disaster, worse than any military defeat. He believed his Air Force commander Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the surrounded troops. That amount would be barely enough to keep the army alive. But Göring was confident. He had done it before at smaller encirclements. He could do it again. What Göring didn't account for was the Russian winter, Soviet air defenses, and the simple mathematics of aerial supply. The Luftwaffe would have needed hundreds of transport aircraft flying, multiple missions per day, in perfect weather conditions, just to meet the minimum requirements. In reality, they never came close. On good days, they delivered 100 tons. On bad days, nothing at all. Aircraft were shot down by Soviet fighters. Pilots got lost in snowstorms. Planes crashed attempting to land on icy airfields inside the pocket. The air bridge became an air trickle that could never hope to sustain 300,000 men. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Soldiers had been issued summer uniforms for the advance into southern Russia. Nobody had expected to still be here when winter arrived. Now temperatures plunged to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. Men froze to death at their posts. Frostbite became epidemic. Wounded soldiers left outside died within minutes. The few buildings that remained standing became desperately contested because they offered minimal shelter from the cold. Food supplies ran out first. The daily ration was cut again and again. Soldiers received bread made from sawdust and whatever grains could be scraped together. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, they ate anything they could find. Hunger became a constant companion, draining strength and will. Men became gaunt shadows of themselves. Disease followed hunger. Typhus spread through the crowded bunkers and basements, where troops huddled for warmth. Dysentery killed those too weak to fight it off. The sick couldn't be properly treated because medical supplies arrived sporadically, or not at all. Ammunition began to run short. Artillery batteries fired less frequently to conserve shells. Infantry units hoarded bullets. Tank crews discovered their vehicles were useless without fuel. The panzers that had terrorized Soviet forces now sat immobile, frozen monuments to German ambitions. Some were buried in snow. Others were stripped for parts. The proud Sixth Army was being reduced to impotence by cold and starvation. But what if relief could reach them? Hitler ordered Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, to organize a rescue operation. Manstein assembled what forces he could, including elite panzer divisions withdrawn from other sectors. In December, he launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to punch through Soviet lines and reach the trapped army. His forces fought with skill and determination, advancing within 30 miles of the pocket. For a brief moment, breakout seemed possible. Manstein sent messages to Paulus. Prepare to attack westward. We'll meet in the middle. Together, we can break the encirclement. Paulus refused to move. He had his orders from Hitler. Stand fast, do not break out. Perhaps he was too loyal. Perhaps he was too cautious. Perhaps he simply didn't believe his weakened forces could manage the breakout. Whatever his reasons, he stayed put. Manstein's relief force stalled and was forced to retreat as Soviet reinforcements arrived. The window of opportunity closed. The Sixth Army would not be rescued. Can you imagine the despair that must have settled over those men? They could see the flares from Manstein's forces in the distance. They knew help was tantalizingly close. Then they watched it fade away, leaving them alone in the frozen hell of the pocket. Hope died harder than the soldiers did. Christmas of 1942 was the bleakest many of those men would ever experience. And for many, it would be their last. Officers tried to maintain morale with small ceremonies and shared memories of home. Soldiers sang carols in frozen bunkers. Letters were written that would never be delivered. Everyone knew the situation was hopeless, but nobody wanted to say it aloud. Discipline began to fray. Some men simply gave up, lying down in the snow to die. Others clung to the impossible dream that somehow, some way, rescue would come. Soviet forces tightened the noose systematically. They launched attacks designed not to break through, but to compress the pocket, squeezing the defenders into smaller and smaller areas. Every week the perimeter shrank. Every week more German positions were overrun. The Soviets could afford to be patient. Time and winter were their allies. They broadcast propaganda over loudspeakers, urging surrender and promising food and warmth. Some German soldiers did surrender, stumbling across no man's land with white flags. Most stayed at their posts, trapped between impossible loyalty and survival instinct. Paulus sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin. His situation reports painted a picture of an army dying by degrees. He requested permission to surrender. Permission was denied. Hitler promoted him to field marshal, a calculated move since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: fight to the last man or take your own life. Those were the only acceptable options. The Potomnik airfield was the main supply point inside the pocket. Transport aircraft landed there under fire, unloaded their meager cargoes, and evacuated wounded on the return flight. Thousands of wounded waited in the cold for flights that never came. When Soviet forces captured Potomnik in January, the air supply situation went from desperate to catastrophic. Only one small auxiliary field remained, and it was under constant artillery bombardment. The final Soviet offensive to eliminate the pocket began on January 10, 1943. This time, there would be no gradual compression. This would be annihilation. Soviet artillery pounded German positions with devastating effect. Infantry and tanks advanced behind the barrage, overwhelming defenders too weak and too few to stop them. The pocket split in two as Soviet forces drove through the center. German units became isolated from each other, fighting separate battles with no hope of mutual support. General Paulus established his headquarters in the basement of a department store in central Stalingrad. It was a surreal location for the command post of a dying army. Outside, his soldiers fought and died in the ruins they had created months earlier. Inside, staff officers maintained military protocols, even as everything collapsed around them. Radio messages became increasingly hopeless. Units reported being overrun. Commanders reported they had no ammunition, no food, no strength left to resist. Then the radio would go dead as another position fell. By the end of January, the 6th Army existed only in fragments. Some units still fought with discipline and courage. Others had dissolved into small groups, just trying to survive one more hour. Soviet forces methodically cleared the remaining pockets of resistance. Building by building, cellar by cellar, they eliminated the defenders. Some German soldiers tried to escape across the frozen Volga, seeking to break out eastward since the west was blocked. Most were killed or captured. A few actually made it through Soviet lines, but died in the wilderness beyond, frozen and starving. On January 31st, Soviet troops stormed Paulus's headquarters. The newly promoted field marshal surrendered, becoming the highest-ranking German officer captured up to that point in the war. He looked gaunt and defeated, a shadow of the confident commander who had approached Stalingrad the previous summer. Around him, his staff officers destroyed documents and accepted the inevitable. They were led away into Soviet captivity. Most would never see Germany again. The last organized German resistance ended on February 2nd, 1943. Scattered groups held out for a few more days, hoping against hope for a miracle that would never come. Then they too surrendered or died where they stood. Of the nearly 300,000 German soldiers trapped in the pocket, only 90,000 survived to become prisoners. The rest died of wounds, disease, starvation, or cold. And of those 90,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity to return home years later. The cost in Soviet lives was equally staggering. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers died in the broader Stalingrad campaign, including the defense of the city and the operations to encircle and destroy the German forces. The city itself was utterly destroyed. Nearly every building was damaged or demolished. The factories were ruins. The homes were rubble. The parks and squares were cratered wastelands. It would take years to rebuild what had been destroyed in months of fighting. But something had shifted fundamentally. The German advance into the Soviet Union was stopped. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Stalingrad proved that the Wehrmacht could be defeated, that Soviet forces could outfight and outthink their opponents, that determination and sacrifice could overcome tactical superiority. News of the victory spread across the Soviet Union, igniting hope that had been dimming through years of defeats and retreats. Allied nations watching from afar realized the war had turned. Germany could be beaten. Hitler never recovered from Stalingrad psychologically. He became more erratic, more suspicious of his generals, more detached from reality. He had invested so much personally in taking the city that its loss wounded him beyond the merely military. German public morale, carefully shielded from bad news by propaganda, took a devastating hit when the disaster could no longer be hidden. Families received letters telling them their sons, husbands, and fathers would not return. The streets of German cities filled with wounded survivors whose haunted eyes told stories words couldn't capture. What happened at Stalingrad transcended military history. It became a symbol of human capacity for both terrible destruction and incredible endurance. The city's name would forever be associated with the absolute extreme of warfare, the point where industrial killing reached its apex. Future generals would study the battle for lessons about urban combat, logistics, and command decisions. Historians would debate endlessly about what might have been if different choices had been made at critical moments. But for those who were there, who fought and died in the ruins, it was something simpler and more profound. It was hell on earth. It was the place where men discovered depths of courage and cruelty they didn't know existed. It was where the war truly turned, where the outcome of the entire conflict began to shift toward the inevitable conclusion that would come 2 years later in Berlin. The city that refused to fall had held, and in holding, it had broken the back of the German war machine. Third, the tide turns red. The winter wind howled across the ruins of Stalingrad as Soviet soldiers picked their way through the debris of battle. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of the catastrophe that had unfolded. Bodies lay frozen in the positions where they had died, preserved by the brutal cold. German soldiers who had surrendered shuffled through the snow in long columns, heading toward prisoner camps in Siberia. They looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed and skeletal. Many collapsed during the march and never rose again. The victors watched them pass with a mixture of triumph and pity. These were the same men who had terrorized their homeland, destroyed their cities, killed their families. Yet seeing them reduced to this state aroused complicated emotions. Soviet photographers documented everything. Images of the destruction would be broadcast across the world. Propaganda value aside, the photographs captured a truth that words struggled to convey. Stalingrad had been utterly consumed by war. The city that once manufactured tractors and steel now produced nothing but corpses and ruins. Engineers estimated it would take a decade to clear the rubble and rebuild. Some suggested abandoning the site entirely and building a new city somewhere else. But Stalin would never allow that. This city bore his name. It would rise again, a monument to Soviet resilience. The prisoners were the lucky ones, though few felt lucky at the time. They had survived when so many others had died. They would live to see another day, even if that day came in a harsh labor camp thousands of miles from home. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They lay in mass graves and scattered across the battlefield. Many would never be identified. Their families would receive letters saying they were missing, presumed dead. The uncertainty would haunt loved ones for years, even decades. Some families never accepted the loss, always hoping their soldier might somehow return. Soviet casualties were equally horrific, but were absorbed differently by a nation already numbed by years of brutal warfare. Every Soviet family had lost someone by 1943. The dead from Stalingrad joined countless others in the collective memory of sacrifice. Mothers who lost sons at Stalingrad had often already buried husbands or brothers earlier in the war. The grief was real, but it was shared across the entire nation. Everyone suffered. Everyone sacrificed. That shared trauma became a source of unity and determination. The strategic implications rippled outward from Stalingrad like earthquake tremors. Germany had lost an entire army, 22 divisions destroyed or captured. Those men and that equipment could never be replaced. The Eastern Front, which had been pushing deeper into Soviet territory for 2 years, was now being pushed back. Hitler's ambitions of conquering the Soviet Union and accessing the oil fields of the Caucasus were finished. The Germans would fight on for over 2 more years, but they would be fighting defensively, giving ground slowly but inexorably. Field Marshal von Manstein organized a desperate fighting retreat through the winter of 1943. His tactical brilliance saved other German armies from encirclement and destruction. But he couldn't change the fundamental reality. Germany was now fighting a war it couldn't win. The industrial might of the Soviet Union, combined with American aid flowing through Lend-Lease programs, overwhelmed German production capacity. Every tank destroyed, every plane shot down, every soldier killed was becoming harder to replace while Soviet numbers grew. What if Hitler had allowed Paulus to break out when Manstein's relief force got close? Historians have debated this endlessly. Perhaps the Sixth Army could have escaped the pocket in December. Perhaps losses would have been heavy but survivable. Perhaps the war would have lasted longer. But this speculative history misses the deeper point. Hitler's decision to stand fast at Stalingrad wasn't a tactical error. It was a symptom of his fundamental disconnection from military reality. He believed willpower could overcome logistics. He believed determination could defeat superior numbers. He was wrong, and Stalingrad proved it definitively. The Soviet victory transformed Stalin's international standing. Before Stalingrad, Western allies had wondered if the Soviet Union could survive. Britain and America debated how much aid to send to what might be a lost cause. After Stalingrad, those doubts evaporated. The Soviets had proved it could not only resist, but defeat the Wehrmacht. Churchill and Roosevelt both sent congratulatory messages. Plans for a second front in Western Europe began to take more concrete shape. The alliance against Hitler solidified around the understanding that Germany could and would be defeated. Soviet military leadership emerged from the battle with enhanced prestige. Marshal Zhukov had planned Operation Uranus and overseen its execution. His reputation as a military genius was cemented. General Zhukov, who had defended the city through its darkest hours, became a national hero. Officers who had demonstrated skill and courage were promoted rapidly. The Red Army was learning, adapting, improving. Early war disasters had been painful but educational. Now, Soviet commanders understood how to fight the Germans and win. The psychological impact on German forces fighting elsewhere was profound. Soldiers on other fronts heard about Stalingrad and wondered if the same fate awaited them. The sense of inevitable victory that had carried the Wehrmacht through early war campaigns evaporated. Now they fought knowing they might lose. Morale problems multiplied. Desertions increased. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and fighting spirit. The German army was still formidable, still capable of tactical brilliance and devastating counterattacks. But the confidence was gone. German civilians began to understand that the war might not end in victory. Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to frame Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice, comparing it to ancient Spartan stands against overwhelming odds. Many Germans believed this narrative or wanted to believe it. Others quietly began to wonder if the leadership had led them into a disaster. Dissent remained suppressed, but doubt spread like poison through the body politic. For the people of Stalingrad, victory was bittersweet. They had lost their city, their homes, their livelihoods. Many had lost family members. The survivors faced years of hardship as reconstruction began. They lived in cellars and bombed out buildings while new structures slowly rose from the rubble. Food remained scarce. Work was hard and often dangerous. Unexploded ordnance littered the ruins, killing people years after the fighting ended. Yet there was also pride. They had been part of something epical. Their city had stopped Hitler's advance. Their sacrifice had turned the war. Vasily Zaitsev, the famous sniper, survived the battle and continued fighting until war's end. He became a Soviet hero whose story was told in books and films. But he rarely spoke about his experiences voluntarily. Those who had been at Stalingrad often shared a reluctance to discuss what they had witnessed. The horror was too great, too personal. They had seen things that couldn't be properly conveyed to those who hadn't been there. A gulf existed between veterans and everyone else, a divide built from trauma and memory. General Paulus spent the rest of the war in Soviet captivity. He was eventually convinced to join the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization of captured German officers who advocated for ending the Nazi regime. After the war, he settled in East Germany and died there in 1957. His decision to surrender rather than fight to the death or commit suicide was controversial among German military circles. Some saw him as pragmatic and humane. Others viewed him as a traitor who broke the military code. He remained a complicated figure, neither villain nor hero, but something more nuanced. The reconstruction of Stalingrad began even before the war ended. Stalin ordered priority given to rebuilding the city as a symbol of Soviet recovery. Workers cleared rubble while fighting continued elsewhere. Architects designed grand buildings and monuments to commemorate the battle. The city would be bigger, more modern, more impressive than before. It would be a showcase of socialist construction, proof that the Soviet system could recover from even the worst devastation. The Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that had changed hands so many times during the battle, became the site of an enormous memorial complex. Completed years after the war, it featured a towering statue called the Motherland Calls. A woman holds a sword aloft, calling her children to defend the homeland. The statue stands over 85 meters tall, visible from across the city. Surrounding it are walls inscribed with the names of the dead, eternal flames, and sculptures depicting the suffering and heroism of the battle. Millions visit the memorial every year, paying respects to those who fought and died there. The Germans established their own memorials and remembrance sites. Cemeteries in Russia and Germany hold the remains of those who died at Stalingrad. Every year, families visit these places, leaving flowers and photographs. Elderly veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, gather to remember comrades lost 8 decades ago. They shake hands with former enemies, having long ago put aside the hatreds that once drove them to kill each other. War, they agree, is humanity's greatest failure. Yet they also take pride in having survived it, in having done their duty as they understood it. Historians continue to study Stalingrad from every angle. Military historians analyze the tactics and strategies, the decisions made and roads not taken. Social historians examine how civilians coped with the devastation and what the battle meant for Soviet society. German historians grapple with how the disaster fit into the broader arc of Nazi aggression and defeat. Russian historians emphasize the heroism and sacrifice, while sometimes glossing over controversial aspects like Stalin's harsh discipline. The truth is complex and often uncomfortable for all sides. Archaeological work in Stalingrad continues to this day. Construction projects regularly uncover remains of soldiers, weapons, equipment. Each discovery brings new insights into the battle and new grief to families who finally learn the fate of missing loved ones. DNA testing has allowed some remains to be identified and returned to descendants for proper burial. Other remains are reinterred in military cemeteries with full honors. The dead continue to emerge from the earth, reminding the living that history isn't fully past. Can you imagine walking through modern Volgograd as Stalingrad was renamed in 1961? You would see a thriving city of over 1 million people. Factories operate. Universities educate young people. Families live ordinary lives. Yet everywhere are reminders of what happened here. Street names reference battles and heroes. Monuments mark key positions. Museums display artifacts and tell stories. The past coexists with the present in a way that few other places experience. The lessons of Stalingrad resonate far beyond military academies. The battle demonstrated the limits of air power in supporting ground operations. It showed the critical importance of logistics and supply lines. It proved that even the most powerful military could be defeated if opposing forces had sufficient determination and resources. Urban warfare, which would become increasingly common in later conflicts, found its template in Stalingrad's ruins. Every street fight, every building-by-building battle since then has been compared to what happened on the Volga in 1942 and 43. The human cost remains almost incomprehensible. Current estimates suggest over 2 million people died in the Stalingrad campaign when you include soldiers on both sides, civilians, and those who died from battle-related causes like starvation and disease. 2 million individual tragedies. 2 million lives cut short. 2 million futures that never happened. Behind each statistic was a person with dreams, fears, loved ones, and potential. They died in the frozen ruins for causes they might not have fully understood, serving leaders who sent them into hell. Yet from that hell emerged something unexpected. Stalingrad became a symbol of what humans can endure when they must. It showed that no oppression is permanent, no conquest inevitable, no victory certain. The city that was supposed to fall stood. The army that was supposed to win lost. The war that seemed unwinnable was won. Those who suffered most paid a terrible price, but their sacrifice mattered. It changed the course of history in ways both large and small. Today, veterans from all sides agree on one thing. War is not glorious. War is not an adventure. War is horror, suffering, and waste on a scale that leaves permanent scars on individuals and nations. They urge younger generations to learn from their experiences, to seek peace even when it seems difficult, to remember that those on the other side of any conflict are also human beings with families and hopes. The old enemies have become allies in the cause of remembrance and reconciliation. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of the defining moments of the 20th century. It marked the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. It demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature. It showed our capacity for terrible violence and incredible courage. It revealed how easily nations can stumble into conflicts that consume millions of lives. And it reminds us that even in the darkest times, resistance is possible, victory is achievable, and hope can survive against overwhelming odds. The ruins have been rebuilt, the dead have been mourned. The battles have been analyzed and memorialized, but the fundamental questions raised by Stalingrad remain relevant. How far will humans go in pursuing victory? What sacrifices are justified in the name of ideology or national survival? When does determination become stubbornness? And when does pragmatism become cowardice? These are not abstract questions. They face every generation in different forms. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a crucible that tested everything about the nations involved. Germany's war machine, thought invincible, was broken there. Soviet resolve, questioned by allies and enemies alike, was proven there. The strategies and technologies of modern warfare evolved there. The psychology of total war was exposed there. And the price of ambition, pride, and hatred was paid there in blood and suffering beyond measure. As we look back across 8 decades, the magnitude of what happened at Stalingrad hasn't diminished. If anything, it has grown as we've gained perspective on the war's trajectory and outcome. The city's stand gave the Allies time to build up their forces. It convinced neutral nations to join the Allied cause. It inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. One city's refusal to surrender cascaded into a transformation of the entire war. The final statistic that matters most is this. After Stalingrad, Germany never again mounted a successful strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. They would fight defensive battles, tactical counterattacks, and desperate holding actions. But the initiative had shifted permanently. From February 1943 onward, the Red Army was advancing and the Wehrmacht was retreating. The road from Stalingrad led ultimately to Berlin. The city that bore Stalin's name had held, and in holding, had ensured the defeat of those who tried to conquer it. And so today, we discovered that Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when the tide of the entire Second World War turned red with the blood of millions. Personally, I believe that no victory was ever purchased at a higher cost, and no defeat was ever more devastating. But I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the sacrifice was justified? Could the outcome have been different? Share your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Pages from History. Turn on notifications so you never miss our epic historical documentaries. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next chapter of history.